So like I mentioned, I'm the Northern Lower Peninsula historian for the Michigan History Center, and we are part of the Department of Natural Resources. So when most people hear the DNR, you think kind of hunting, fishing, parks, camping, that kind of stuff. But we are also housed in the DNR. And the Michigan History Center, if super briefly, if you're not familiar, we are the home of the State Museum in Lansing. We also have, so we are a family of 12 museums and historic sites scattered around the state. I am responsible for a couple of those: the Hartwick Pines Logging Museum at Hartwick Pines State Park, the Higgins Lake Nursery, which was Michigan's first tree nursery, and the Civilian Conservation Corps Museum, which is located on the site of the Higgins Lake Nursery at North Higgins Lake State Park. And we'll talk a little bit about the museum at the very end of my presentation. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So before we can really get into the nitty-gritty of the Civilian Conservation Corps, it's helpful to talk about what did Michigan look like and what's happening in Michigan prior to the 1930s, prior to the work that the CCC did. And it's just helpful to understand that a lot of northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula looked like this image here. The White Pine logging era was operating about 1860 to 1910, and it did great things for Michigan's economy and our population, but it was quite devastating to our forests and our river systems. So we get these burnt, cut over lands that look a lot like this image here. And a lot of our river systems end up looking like this one. A lot of flooding, a lot of bank erosion, extreme habitat loss, so lack of fish spawning grounds, a lot of loss of other types of habitat as well. So there was some pretty extreme environmental destruction in many ways. And that's kind of, very brief overview of what's going on in Michigan prior to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, what really spurs the CCC to happen is, of course, the Great Depression, which was 1929 through the late 1930s. And in 1933, unemployment nationally was 24.9%. FDR, he took office on March 4th, 1933. And in his inaugural address, he outlines this plan for the New Deal. And this image on the right is a chart of the unemployment rates from 1930 through 1945. And it's just something to keep in mind when we start to talk about, in a little while, at the end of the CCC, look at how low the unemployment rate gets, as we get near and enter World War II. But then look at the early 30s, the very, very high unemployment rate. And when we're talking about the Great Depression, specifically in Michigan, our unemployment rate rose to 34%, so higher than the national average. And nationally, African-American unemployment rates were much higher. In Detroit, for example, they reached 60%. And also Native American unemployment rates were much higher than the national average, typically well over 50%. And here's a couple of images for you. On the left, we have a lineup of people in a food line in Flint in 1938. And on the right, some folks getting food from firemen in Detroit in 1931. So when Roosevelt, he takes office early March, and very, very quickly he passes the New Deal into law on March 15th, which is incredibly fast. And the New Deal, of course, includes the Civilian Conservation Corps, but some other things as well, like the Works Progress Administration, the Rural Electrification Administration, It also includes banking regulations, financial reform, and the Social Security Act. But we are here to talk about the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this program was in operation from 1933 through 1942. And it is a system of camps. So unlike a program like the Works Progress Administration, where that you still live at home and you work probably in your community, the CCC is a system of camps. So if you, let's say, if you're from Michigan and want to be in the CCC, you're probably going to stay in the state because we had a lot of CCC camps, as we'll see in a minute. But if you are in a state that doesn't have very many camps, you might be shipped to Michigan, just as an example. So it's a system of camps that the young men live in. The program is operated by the War Department, and the program pays enrollees $30 per month. In today's dollars, that's about $1,620. And enrollees only keep 5 of those dollars. The rest goes directly into a savings account or to their family. And it is a 6-month commitment that they sign up for. And as is in the title of the program, it is focused on conservation projects. And those conservation projects are going to be based on the state and what the need is in that area. So a lot of the things that we talked about left over from the logging era, here in Michigan, we need trees replanted. We need a lot of river restoration and habitat rebuilding. We are having a really bad fire problem, and so we need firefighting. Places out west, we're dealing with the Dust Bowl, so they're working on a lot of soil conservation. The CCC are building the Blue Ridge Parkway. So it just depends on the location of the camp and the specific conservation need of the area. And there's a huge education and trade component to the program, which we'll talk about. And one of the biggest things that the program does, besides the money, is it also supplies enrollees with all the clothing, toiletries, and food that they will need. A lot of these boys, they get on the train to come to camp and they don't even have shoes on. That's how dire straits a lot of these families were in. Had so little money, their young men didn't even have shoes. So whether it's winter or summer, the CCC provides all of the clothing that an enrollee will need. The toiletry kit comes with everything from a sewing kit to repair your clothes, to a toothbrush and razor and mirror and soap. And then of course they're getting 3 square meals a day provided by the camp. And when it comes to the enrollees, who are they? Who can an enrollee be to get into the CCC? When the program first begins, you have to be 17 to 23 years old, although that age range is expanded as the program goes on, or you can be a veteran of World War I or the Spanish-American War. And Native American camps are operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We had 1 Native American camp here in Michigan, and they have much looser enrollment guidelines. There is not that tight age restriction, and because we saw that super high unemployment rate of Native Americans, and they also don't have that strict enrollment. So if you are in a regular CCC camp, you have your 6 months. If you left early, you couldn't just come back. But the Native American camps, they would let men go home, for example, to finish up the harvest, and then they could come back to camp. So they were much looser in regards to those guidelines. This program is only for men. Women could participate in some other New Deal programs, but and there was a very short-lived program called, not so nicely called, the She-She-She's, sponsored by Eleanor Roosevelt, which was not very successful. But this program is for men only. You have to be single, and you have to weigh at least 107 pounds. And this one always really gets me, because think about a 17-year-old boy today who has to weigh, at least 107 pounds. That's a very small teenage boy. And this just really speaks to the depression and the malnutrition that a lot of these people are suffering from. Also, your family has to be on some type of government assistance. So you have to really prove that you need this program. And enrollees are disproportionately white, even though that Black unemployment rate is much higher than the white unemployment rate. Black enrollment is capped nationally at 10%. And I will mention also, the program was integrated. FDR wanted it to be integrated when it began, but that didn't work out. And by 1935, the program was segregated nationally. So the CCC in Michigan, our first CCC camp was established May 2nd, 1933. And remember, the New Deal went into effect March 15th. So that's, we're talking about the speed at which government works. That is just remarkably fast. And by the end of that year, we had 77 camps in Michigan. And by the end of the program, we had 126 camps. And this image on the right, I apologize, I don't know specifically which Michigan camp this is, but this is a winter camp. So a lot of the camps, when they first get established, their first project is building the actual camp. And sometimes the supplies didn't arrive. They didn't have time to get that finished before winter came. So a lot of CCC boys in Michigan had to endure a very cold, harsh winter living in tents their first winter. And I know this is small, but this is a map of all the CCC camps in Michigan. If you come to the CCC Museum, you can see this really big. But I wanted to include this just to give you an idea of where the camps are at. And remember, this program is serving a conservation need, not just an economical need. So if you look at where the dots are on this map, this tells you really, where those trees need to be replanted, where those fires need to be fought, where those rivers need to be restored, and where there's a lot of state park infrastructure to be built. So, we're talking mainly northern Michigan and a lot in the Upper Peninsula, a few camps up on Isle Royal, and just a couple down in southern Michigan. Oh, and I do want to mention the colored dots, if you can tell on here, because I know it's small. I mentioned those camps that were segregated. So these blue dots, those are all of the African-American camps. And the yellow dots, these are veteran companies. Remember, you could be a veteran of World War I or the Spanish-American War. And you can't really tell the color on here, but our only Native American camp, if you can see oops, I lost my pointer, there it is, was Camp Marquette in Chippewa County, outside Sault Ste. Marie. That was our only Native American camp in Michigan. So I've already mentioned it a couple of times, but here in Michigan, one of the huge projects CCC boys are working on is planting trees. And boy, oh boy, did they plant trees. They planted 484 million of them. And that is twice as many as were planted in any other state. So that really speaks to how badly we needed to replant our forests. So we have some really wonderful images here On the left, some Michigan CCC boys, looks like they're maybe taking a break from planting. And I love this image because right in between these two men in the foreground, there's a white pine stump left over from the logging era. So they are literally replanting the trees, in this forest that once was. And on the right, you have a CCC boy. I think he's posing for the camera. He's demonstrating how to use this bar in his hand as a planting bar or a dibble. And he's going to jam that into the ground and create the space to plant the seedling. And so in his left hand, that is a box with some seedlings in it. And some of you, when you're driving down a Michigan road, you may have seen a forest that looks like this one, with probably a little bigger trees by now. But this is an image of CCC planted red pine growing in those perfectly straight rows. So it's pretty easy to tell sometimes when you come across a stand of CCC planted trees. They also built 7,000 miles of roads in Michigan and built 500 bridges. So you can some images here of some young men hard at work doing some road building. And then on the right, an image of a bridge that they built. And they spent a tremendous amount of time fighting forest fires, 140,000 man days. And on the left, these young men are digging a fire break. So there's probably an active fire nearby, and they are digging a fire break so that you have that break in fuel. So hopefully the fire kind of gets to the break and doesn't jump the line because it has a lack of fuel. And on the right, this young man is fighting a fire with a backpack sprayer. So this pack on his back is filled with water, and he has a nozzle in his hand, and that is what he's using to actually fight the fire. And remember that a lot of these young men are from the city. So think about where Michigan's population centers are: Detroit, Grand Rapids, Jackson, Flint. So a lot of these boys, they've grown up in the city, they're used to city life, and a lot of them talk about they get into the CCC and they experience real darkness for the first time because they're in northern Michigan, or they're in the UP and there are no streetlights. They experience true quiet for the first time. There's no city noises. And this program for a lot of them ends up being much harder than they were expecting, and dangerous. For example, being in the middle of a raging forest fire with just a backpack sprayer on your back. So also to combat our terrible forest fire problem, they built dozens of fire towers around the state. So on the left, we have some young men. I'm pretty sure these young men are from Camp Hale, which is near the Tawas area. And they are building the cabin for the tower man. So they built the fire tower here, and now they're building the cabin. And then on the right, this is a fire, the Welcome Lake fire of May 1937, that the CCC was fighting. And they're building state and national park infrastructure by the 30s. And afterwards, we have this growing car culture. People are looking to road trip and visit state and national parks. And there is an extreme lack of infrastructure. People show up to parks, there are nowhere to picnic. There's nowhere to go to the bathroom. If you're using a beach, there's nowhere to change. There's no parking lots. There's no trails to hike. So CCC camps get established at places like Hartwick Pines State Park, where they build our trail infrastructure and bathroom buildings and campgrounds. And on the left, this is the picnic pavilion at Orchard Beach State Park. It's actually been in the news a few months back because of the high water level eroding the shoreline. This pavilion was in danger of falling into Lake Michigan. So it made some headlines around here. The building was actually moved, picked up and moved elsewhere in the park to save it. And the image on the right, this is the bathhouse at Ludington State Park. So chances are, if you're a frequent state park user here in Michigan, you have probably hiked a trail that the CCC built, or picnic under a roof that the CCC built. And a couple more images on the left. This is one of the camps on Isle Royal. Looks like these men have just built a bridge over a stream. And on the right, this is the Seney National Wildlife Refuge. So there were a couple camps in the Seney area, and the CCC boys created the Seney National Wildlife Refuge. So if any of you have been there, you'll know today it's this great place for migratory waterfowl. There are lots of ponds and wild grasses and dams, and the CCC created that. All of that is artificial. They created and planted all of that. So that's what's happening in this image here. And like I mentioned, stream restoration. So all of that damage to our rivers from log drives. The young men are busy doing a lot of bank restoration, rebuilding fish habitat, and even in the wintertime. So this image on the right, these poor young men are working in an icy cold river in the winter. You can see there's snow all around them. And they did many other things as well. On the left, these young men, looks like they're probably working on some soil conservation or some riverbank restoration. It looks actually to me like they're probably terracing the riverbank. So it looks like. And on the right, this is an image from Camp Kuzno, which is kind of southeast of Munising in the Upper Peninsula. And they did wildlife research at Camp Kuzno. So this young man, he looks very proud of himself feeding this moose calf. They did mainly research with deer and moose. And education. As I mentioned briefly, that education was part of the program. And a lot of these boys, they left school early to try to find work to help their families. So many of them had never finished 8th grade. Some didn't even know how to read and write. So you had to learn how to read and write. You could get your 8th grade diploma. You could get your high school diploma. You could even take correspondence courses through the University of Michigan. And many of the young men took advantage of this part of the program. The image on the right, there are some enrollees here who have just earned their high school diploma. And trades and vocational skills. This was also a very important part of the program. So one of the goals, overarching goals of the CCC was they wanted these young men to leave the program and be successful in life, have an education, have a trade, and they could go out into the world and be successful. So that's why learning a trade or a skill was so important. And it really depended on the camp you were at, because they really depended on local people to come in and teach these skills and trades. And so for at Camp Higgins Lake, for example, they mainly taught drafting and map making. That's just the thing that they taught there. On the right, this image is the Gaylord Repair Shop. This is the auto repair shop for the entire CCC in Michigan. And in this image, only 2 of these men are, I don't know which 2, I apologize for that, but I do know only 2 of the men in this picture are actual auto mechanics. Everybody else is a CCC enrollee learning this trade. And on the right, this gentleman, or excuse me, this image on the left, this gentleman here on the left is teaching these young men how to file a saw. And of course, they're having fun. They're young men. They want to have a good time. So on the weekends, a lot of them take advantage of going into local towns, going to movies, dances, meeting the local young women. A lot of CCC boys meet their wives in local towns. A lot of the camps had orchestras. So that's what this image on the left, this is a CCC orchestra. And they would get invited to play at local functions, local dances and parties. And of course, they're playing sports. Again, they're young men. So most of the camps establish baseball teams. This is a basketball team here from Camp Duck Lake. And there are swim teams, boxing, and a lot of the camps compete against each other. So this basketball team here, the picture tells us they are the Fort Brady champions of 38 and 39. And Fort Brady is the CCC district in the Upper Peninsula. So Camp Duck Lake, I guess, beat all the other UP teams that season. And they goof around. We see time and time again CCC pictures and scrapbooks and it's very much like this image on the left. They're just goofing around. They are, standing on top of each other, like the image on the right. They're on roofs. They're laughing. So it's nice to see that they worked really hard, and sometimes it was dangerous, and they were learning a lot. But they're still young men, and they're still goofing around and having a fun time. And I don't worry about, there's a lot of text here. I'm going to read these quotes, but whenever I do one of these programs, I think it's important that you hear, what they have to say about the program. And really, the only way to do that is to read some quotes. So I'll go ahead and start. On life before the CCC, I had nothing to do. You couldn't have any money to buy anything, so you stole or did without. The soles of my shoes kept falling off, and I taped them, but they did not hold and kept falling off. And that's from Michael Radage. Once you got into camp, you wanted to get home. But after receiving a letter from your family, who received $25 and told you what they had been able to purchase with that money, a coat, food, and wood for the stove, you felt for the first time that you were helping your family, and nothing could induce you to leave the CCC. Again, that's Michael Radage. And I remember one night we missed the truck back to camp and had to walk from Cook's Corners to camp, which was about 15 miles. It was a moonlit night and the temperature was down to -20 degrees. This was the night I heard a wolf howl, not a coyote. And unfortunately, I don't have a person to attribute that quote to. And then I'd gotten my boots wet that day, and it was so cold overnight in the unheated barracks that my boots stuck to the floor. Robert Fyvie from Camp Drumfask. And I can attest to this. So when we talk about the CCC Museum in a bit, the museum is a recreated CCC barracks. Just like a real barracks, it has no insulation. And I dread having to do work in the museum in the wintertime. It's closed in the winter, but if I ever have to go in there, it is colder inside than it is outside. So even if it's 25 degrees outside, you have to go outside to warm up. So I can see how his boots froze to the floor. And the program, not only did it have this wonderful impact on the participants, it had a very big impact on the local communities. The CCC brought electricity and telephone lines to rural areas. Prior to the C's, only something like 30% of Michigan had electricity. So they, even today, a lot of rural areas in Michigan that have electricity and telephone line that hasn't been upgraded in ages, that was originally brought to those places by the CCC. They helped dig out after snowstorms. They helped find missing people. The program also employed local men. So again, I'm bringing this image back of this gentleman teaching these boys how to sharpen a saw. And this guy here on the left, he's obviously not an enrollee, and he is probably what we call an LEM, because we're the government and we like acronyms, a local experienced men. And they were paid for their work. They were paid about 3 times as much as a CCC enrollee. And it just depended on your skill. So if you were a forester, maybe an out of work forester or firefighter at Hartwick Pines, the CCC built our logging museum, which are log structures. So there would have been someone in the local community who knew how to do that type of construction. So they brought that person or those people into the camp, employed them, and those were the people actually teaching the men or the enrollees how to build the building and how to do these things. So it's contributing to the local community, to the local economy in that way. But of course, the camps, big camps, there might be like 200 enrollees at one camp, and the camp has to purchase supplies. Of course, they're getting some stuff from the War Department, but they're going to need fresh food, tools, things like that. They're buying all of that from the local community. And in total, the program put something like $20 million into Michigan's economy. And they get to celebrate sometimes. So we have a lot of these Thanksgiving and Christmas menus, and these are both in the archives of Michigan, and we have a few in the museum collection. And this just goes to show that it wasn't the same foods all the time, although they were eating well. Most enrollees within the first couple of months, they gained like 10 to 15 pounds because they were finally getting the nutrition that they needed. But when we have these special holidays, they really upped the ante. And I love looking at these menus. I won't read everything aloud. I'll let you guys take a peek. But I just love that there's always olives and pickles is one of the first courses. Over here on the Christmas menu, we also have some olives. And I'm from the UP, and any good party has to have a tray with olives and pickles. So I can see how it's funny that that's still the same. But then for desserts, they get assorted fresh fruit, cigars, and cigarettes. And over here as well, the Christmas menu for dessert, they get some mixed nuts, cigars, and mixed candy. And this menu on the right, it looks kind of crinkly because it's printed on a copper sheet. So they really were excited about their Christmas menu, I guess. And the program ends in 1942, like I mentioned earlier. And mostly the reason for that is the unemployment rate is so far from what it was. It's so low. This program is just not needed anymore. There's a really rising negative opinion about the program, that it's very expensive. It's costing taxpayers a lot of money and is just not needed anymore. And also a lot of people throughout the history of the program, they complain that they don't want the CCC to turn their sons into perfect little soldiers. And it kind of does that in a way. Young men get used to living this very regimented lifestyle. And in starting around 1940, 41, clearly the United States can see where things are heading. And they start adding drill into the morning routine of CCC enrollees. So that's another thing that people really don't like. This program is supposed to be to boost the economy, to give these boys an education and skills and work on conservation projects, not to be little camps for training soldiers. So there's a really rising negative opinion for a couple reasons, and the program is officially ended July 1st, 1942. And this image on the right, if you're interested, this is an aerial view of Camp Higgins Lake, which if you're familiar with North Higgins Lake State Park, this camp is about just 5 miles north of the state park, where the state park is today. But what happened next? We had 126 CCC camps scattered around the state. What happens to all of them? Well, some are just disbanded and the buildings are left to crumble. There are places like Camp Higgins Lake where you can still go and see foundations. Some of the camps are dispersed. These buildings were only ever meant to be temporary. So some of the buildings are taken apart piece by piece. They are moved elsewhere, utilized in state parks for different, or maybe like forestry offices used for different purposes. Camp Hartwick Pines for a short time, the structures there were a work camp, like a prison camp. Buildings were used for that. And even some of the houses that were built for the camp officers. So because these camps were run by the War Department, there were actual Army officers on site in charge of these camps. And often they would have their wives and their families there with them. So they got nice houses to live in. They didn't live in the barracks. And I know here, I live in St. Ignace, and actually part of my in-laws' house was a CCC officer's house at Camp Mackinac. So some of the actual house, not just the camp buildings, but the houses were picked up, moved, and reused by others. We do have one CCC camp here in Michigan that is, unfortunately, I haven't been there yet, but it's being reused mostly in its entirety. So it's a great place to go see what an actual CCC camp looked like, and that is the Akiak Outdoor Center. 7 of our camps were reused as POW camps during World War II. And 2 of our camps were used as conscientious objector camps. And one of them was Camp Germfask, and that's the image on the right here. These are conscientious objectors being housed at Camp Germfask. And this is a very interesting story that I would like to know more about. It's interesting the way local communities in Michigan viewed these conscientious objectors. That local communities would actually play baseball games with the German POWs and the conscientious objectors, and the POWs would play baseball against conscientious objectors, and the local town people would come out and they would root for the German POWs. They actually were, more in favor of the POWs than the conscientious objectors. And a lot of people, I get this question all the time, and I get a ton of emails. And when I do tours of the museum, people always ask, how do I research my family member that was in the CCC? And I'm guessing at least somebody attending tonight had a CCC family member. That's why you're here. And CCC personnel records are held nationally in the National Archives and Records Administration in St. Louis. They are treated like military records because the program was operated by the War Department. So to request records of a family member, you have to go through the National Archives. And there's a link here, but all you have to do is Google National Archives CCC Records, and it should be the first link that pops up. And everything I've written here will be there. It has a form to fill out. What was their name? if you know other bits and pieces about them, do you know what camp they served at? Do you know the date they were born? That kind of stuff. And if you have any CCC paperwork left over from some family members, maybe you found in an attic or a desk. I also get a fair amount of questions or people that find discharge papers, for example, and they would like to donate their discharge papers to the archives, which you can do. But I also get people asking me, what do all these numbers mean? So the kind of reddish orange circle on the left, this is the company number. And the V tells us it's a veteran company. So that is the actual number of the company of men. And the teal circle, the S62, that is the camp code. And the S tells us that is a state camp as opposed to a federal camp. So we have just an S would be a state park camp, and an SF is going to be a state forest camp. And then Vanderbilt, that's going to be the name of the camp, although that can be tricky because camps can have a lot of nicknames, and camps are often named after the nearest post office. So just because this is called Camp Vanderbilt doesn't mean it's in Vanderbilt. It just means that Vanderbilt was the nearest post office. So the actual camp location, which I don't know all the camp locations in Michigan, there were 126 of them. So this camp could actually be like 25 miles away from Vanderbilt. So it can be a little tricky and confusing to figure out, okay, where was my grandpa or my uncle, where were they actually at? And sometimes CCC boys had different names for specific camps. So like in a scrapbook, for example, we'll know what camp they were at because they have their company number, but they will call the camp something that we don't call it that. There's Camp Strongs, for example, and through maybe a spelling error, people in a scrapbook labeled it Camp Strangs with an A, not an O. So when we were redoing the museum exhibits, it made things a little tricky and confusing. And this is the Michigan CCC Museum, if you haven't been there. So it is a recreated CCC barracks, and it was opened in 1986. And it was built by CCC alumni. So this image in the center, that is some CCC boys. They always, no matter how old they were, they always called themselves CCC boys. And they are they're signing their names on the floorboards of the museum. And they were meeting at the Higgins Lake Nursery in North Higgins Lake State Park for reunions. I think just because it's centrally located in the state. So it just made sense to them that that's where they wanted the museum to go. And they are the ones that decided it should be a barracks. They wanted it to look like the barracks that they knew and they remembered. And legacy of the CCC, of course, national and state park infrastructure all over the country. I mentioned in the beginning, the Blue Ridge Parkway, for example, all the infrastructure on Isle Royal, most of that was done by the CCC. And if the CCC had never happened, it's impossible to know how many years behind we would be, but I would hazard a guess to say, at least a couple decades. They did so much work in such a short period of time. And that's why we call them the tree army or the soil soldiers. They came in and did so much that if that program hadn't happened, think of the years and years and years it would take to build those same trails, build those same picnic pavilions. And also, where would the money come from? This program was funded nationally. So that helped move things along. So we have so much of that to thank the CCC for. And of course, our forests, our beautiful lush forests in northern Michigan and in the Upper Peninsula, like we talked about, 484 million trees, some of which are still standing. So they did so much to reforest the state. Our healthy streams that we have, if you come up to the Roscommon, the Grayling area, we have world-class fly fishing. People come from all over the world to fly fish here. People are coming from all over the world to do hiking, kayaking, see waterfalls, all kinds of things here in Michigan. And so much of that people are able to do directly because of the hard work of the CCC. And some people will say that we were successful in World War II because so many of these young men were in the CCC. They were used to this regimented lifestyle. So when they entered the seas, they were used to all of it. They had literally worn the clothes, because when the CCC first began, they were wearing surplus World War I outfits, and the blankets, the cots, it was all surplus World War I stuff that had been in storage. But remember, one of those negative opinions of the program was, you're going to turn our boys into your perfect little soldiers. And that's kind of what the program did a little bit. So, is it the only reason? No, of course not. Is it a reason that we won? Probably. And this image on the right, this is our CCC boy statue. And this is the one at the CCC Museum. The same alumni group that had the museum constructed in the mid-90s, they commissioned an artist to design this mold and cast this statue. So we have the first one. We're very happy about that. And today you can find these statues all over the country. And I often get asked if the CCC still exists. In its original form, no, but it does exist in different ways. And it really lives on, the spirit of it lives on in the AmeriCorps program. If you're familiar with that, it's basically like a domestic version of the Peace Corps. People go around the state around the country working on conservation projects. And here in Michigan, we do have a Michigan CCC. Many states have their own small version of the CCC. Ours is very, very tiny. Our CCC members work at the DNR sign shop, which is at Hartwick Pines State Park. So this lady in the center, she is a Michigan CCC member, and she is hand painting one of those sandblasted state park signs. So whenever you see the big sandblasted signs at a state park, and even the smaller reflective metal or wood signs, those are all made at the DNR sign shop at Hartwick Pines by Michigan CCC members. And numerous conservation programs throughout the United States can really trace their roots back to the CCC. And hopefully some folks, I think I did quite well with about 10 minutes left. So hopefully some of you have questions. This is all my contact information. If you are looking to donate something, if you have CCC photos from a family member or memorabilia, and you're curious about what to do with it, you can feel free to send me an email, and you can give me a call. My office is at the Hartwick Pines Visitor Center. That second number there is my work cell. And I will tell you guys though, if you have a question, you should probably do it soon or wait a few months, because I'm about to go on maternity leave. So, if you contact me in a month and you're like, geez, the Hillary girl seemed nice and she didn't email me back, it's because I'm out of the office for a while.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And do feel free to put your questions in the chat or to unmute yourself if anyone does have any questions for Hillary. It was really interesting and you covered a lot, but there there may still be questions. So if anyone would like to ask anything, go right ahead. Just wait for a sec. Wow, you covered everything so well that we're not having clamoring for questions here. Let's see. Watching the chat. Oh, someone said thank you. So informative. And
Thanks.
congratulations to you. Is this your first baby?
It is, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Congratulations. What's the due date?
July 15th.
So, yeah, coming up pretty soon. I'm glad we got to see you before you go out on maternity leave.
Oh, thank you.
You see the other comment there? I
Yeah.
cannot unmute, but congrats on your baby. Yeah, that's one of our wonderful library people there.
Yeah, and there is so much to know about the CCC. I always tell people, you could spend your whole career just researching and becoming an expert on the CCC in Michigan, like where all their camps are, what they all did. It is, multi-layered, this program, because it was federal, but also there were state forest camps and state park camps. So things get really murky, and I do a lot of other things. I don't just research the CCC or talk about the Cs. So it's really fascinating, and I'm always learning more. But there's always questions usually that come up, and I'm just like, I don't know. That's so interesting.
You mentioned that the work was dangerous, and I thought, like, dangerous, like people died doing this. I mean, with that one guy with the fire and that small amount of water, he would have had what looked like a pretty raging fire.
Yes, and there were I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's a small number, but still tragic. There were a few CCC boys who were killed fighting forest fires. There were a few people killed. The Cs used dynamite for a lot of things, like road building. So there were a few CCC boys injured and killed that because of dynamite accidents.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, sometimes there were, just like us today, there are freak accidents. So they had sometimes truck accidents, like transporting people back and forth. So there were some boys killed, and yeah, a lot of them, if you come to the museum, we have some quotes within the exhibits that talk about, I was expecting to come to this program, and they don't say the word cushy, but you kind of get that interpretation.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Then they talk about, and there I was, in the middle of a fire with blisters on my hands from using a shovel, and my skin is burning. So it was definitely a very rude awakening for a lot of them. It was not what they were expecting.
Yeah, yeah. No, it sounds like it was rough, but I can also see the camaraderie and being outside. Hard physical work outside is not always the worst thing. From my small amount of experience doing this, I have to say I enjoyed it a bit, but not fighting those fires. That seems really dangerous and scary.
Yeah.
Well, are there any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Hillary. This was a wonderful presentation, and I had been wanting to have it for a while. Really, this is really great program. I did some work stationed for the CCC in Oakland, California, and it was an interesting bunch of people. Thank you and congratulations. Yeah, so would have been older people then. At the CCC in Oakland, California, right? By the time, because
You were younger.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Jason, do you mean like the new version of the CCC in California?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was an interesting ragtag kind of bunch of people, but they were younger. They were not quite kids, but they were 18 to probably 23.
Yep.
And then go out in 3 or 4 vans and have their little portable toilets towed along behind them, and off they go every day.
Wow, so
Yeah.
there are these kind of programs going on in individual states then, no longer a federal program like that, but
Mhm.
Yeah.
interesting. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we'll let you go. Thanks again
All
so
right.
much, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Appreciate it. And there will be a combination. I'll let you all in on a secret. There's going to be combination programs remote like this over Zoom that we some of us have gotten pretty used to, but we'll also in the fall be having some programs in person. And I just made my first in-person program. Is going to be the author of a new Arcadia book, Farming in Northern Macomb County. She did a talk for us on Macomb County in general. And she's going to be doing, oh no, I think it was Macomb Township, I'm sorry. But she's going to be doing this program. I don't know if it's October. It'll be coming up. Watch for the new library booklet that has all the programs, because you'll see an interesting mix of in-person for those who are feeling that and not in-person programs. So we'll be sticking with Zoom for some things and in-person for others. But so thank you again so much, Hillary, and best wishes to you. Hope everything goes easily and fun. Do you know, boy or girl?
We don't know.
Yay! How old-fashioned. I like that. Nice. Yeah, I didn't know, but my son just turned, or he will turn 35 pretty soon. So there was a time when, yeah, nobody knew. So
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
hope you
thank you
have
so
a
much.
happy surprise.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. This was my last presentation before I go on leave, and this is one of the things I like to do the most. So
Oh,
I appreciate I get to go into maternity leave on a good note. This was fun. Thank you.
thank you, Hillary, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Bye-bye.
Bye.